I am so very excited to welcome two amazing mystery writers because, yes, we have had the pleasure of having both of these authors before at Politics and Prose tonight to talk about their newest books. Introduced with Murder in the Marais, Aimée Leduc, Cara Black's smart, compelling private investigator, has been solving crimes in the City of Light for 20 years. Murder in Bel-Air, her 19th case, starts with an emergency call. Her mother failed to pick up Amy's daughter at school. Canceling an important speech, Amy rushes to where her mother was last seen talking to a homeless woman. That woman, who was carrying a lot of cash, has since been murdered. Following Amy's search for her mother, Black gives us a rich taste of the sights and sounds of the 12th arrondissement. And then we have another powerful detective woman, the first woman lawyer in 1920s Bombay. Perveen Mistry, star of Sujata Massey's bestselling The Widows of Malabar Hill, is also, when the occasion calls for it, a detective. Her second case involves a delicate situation in the princely state of Satapur, where the royal family is divided over how to educate the young crown prince. Resolving the dispute requires a lawyer, but because the prince's guardians, the dowager queen and daughter-in-law, are living in purdah, they can't speak to men. Brought in by a British official, Perveen finds herself involved in a complicated web of power plays and ancient vendettas. Here to talk more about their stories, please help me welcome Cara Black and Sujata Massey.
Bonsoir.
Oh, namaste. Wow, this is a real treat for us. Can you hear me? Am I coming through on this? We're actually friends, and we've known each other since the 1990s, a really, really long time. But this is our first time we've ever got to, we've had so many conversations,
Yes.
but never one in microphones together.
No,
so,
not usually like this.
yeah, this is great.
But thank you all for coming tonight.
Yeah.
Really, thank you. And thank you, Politics and Prose.
Yeah,
You have a wonderful independent bookstore.
we do. Yeah.
Yeah, you know.
Yep. Here we are.
And here we are.
After all these years. I don't know if it would make sense, since there are probably people here who are Aimée loyalists and then people who know Perveen, if we could each talk a little bit about our new book before I start questioning you.
Yeah, grilling me, right?
Grilling you.
Well, I will say, okay, I'll just jump in. 20 years of Aimée Leduc, and we have a champagne cocktail stiletto here that someone designed in Paris for this event. But yes, I write the Aimée Leduc investigations. I just kill people all over Paris, basically. And Aimée Leduc is my half French, half American detective who inherited a detective agency based on the real Duluc detective in Paris and has turned it to computer security. In this case, so now it's 19 books. We're in 1999. She has a daughter, Chloe, who's 10 months old. And so she's pulled out of her big talk to network and grab all these wonderful computer security contracts in Le Train Bleu, which is a very wonderful restaurant, Belle Époque, in the Gare de Lyon. And things spiral from there. And it's set in the 12th arrondissement because my friend's mother lives in the 12th arrondissement. I've often stayed with Madame Gerbeau, and it's very residential and very quiet. And it really surprised me to learn that Madame Gerbeau's neighborhood is where the worst guillotinings of the revolution were, and that a lot of the people that were buried literally next door to her apartment. So that was just a wonderful opportunity, you know, right? Because my mind goes to murder. It was too good to miss. And Perveen is in her second mystery. If you haven't read The Widows of Malabar Hill, which she won 2 or 3 awards for, you could jump right in with the Satapur Moonstone. But talk about Perveen, because she's so unique.
Well, thank you. I feel like she's very real to me. I write this mystery series now. It's set in 1921 Bombay, and I'm going to be in that year for a long time. I'm stretching things out. She has a new, lawyers are busy. Perveen is the first woman lawyer in Bombay, And her lifestyle and the kind of cases she's involved in are inspired by the experiences of India's first two women lawyers who were active. One of them started practicing in the 1890s and one of them in the 20s. And I sort of established that Perveen is working with her father after having had an Oxford education in the first book, The Widows of Malabar Hill. And in this one, she goes a little bit afield, just like Aimée goes afield out of her neighborhood. Perveen actually goes into these beautiful mountains that are about 2 hours outside of Bombay. Now, Mumbai, there are a lot of these hill stations there. And in the old days, there were places, the British would have their postings there, but also there were a whole lot of these little princely states that were actually ruled by Maharajas rather than the British. However, they had to be in cooperation with the government. I've always been fascinated by royalty. When I was a little girl, I thought I was a princess who had been kidnapped. I don't know if anybody else ever told their parents that when they didn't like what their parents were saying, but that was usually what I would tell them and why I didn't want to do something. So I had my own opinion of how wonderful it would be to be a princess. But when I actually began going to places, like I went and I stayed at a palace in Rajasthan that had turned part of its complex into, a hotel using the original guest wing. And, I went in and I toured the areas where the women used to stay in seclusion. The royal women, I realized it was just such a claustrophobic existence. And I looked more and more into the lives of royal women and royal children, and I wanted to tell this story.
I think the last time I saw you, you said, I have to go to India to do research, and I'm going to go stay in a palace in Rajasthan. And I was like, wow, that's tough, And
then once you go, you've got to use it, right? And then it's sort of like there are rhythms in a writer's life. And I felt like I needed a little bit of a vacation from my own life, my own day-to-day life in Baltimore. And so having this story set in the hills with all these wonderful animals around and the nature and, the poisonous plants. And, I really enjoyed that.
Datura and monkeys. Yeah. Yes, very strong.
Yes.
Well, so I'm thinking Aimée should go to a chateau, right? I'm missing the boat here. I think
that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about is that I haven't read every book in your series, but the books I've read have always shown this different Paris, this Paris that's all about immigration and history and change. And I wanted to ask you how you decided to build that Paris that Aimée has, because it could all be foie gras and chateau if you wanted.
Right. Maybe, as I said, maybe I'm missing the boat here, but
your field research could be improved.
I think so. Thank you. Yeah. Well, when I wrote my first book, Murder in the Marais, which was set in 1993, it was a story about my friend's mother, a hidden Jewish girl during the German occupation in Paris. And I had to write that book, and it took me a long time to write it. And when I sold it to Soho Press, we're both the same publisher, my editor said, well, great, where's Aimée going next? And I said, excuse me? And she said, well, with her dog and the man she met and her apartment. You are writing a series, aren't you? And I lied and said, of course I am. So I just really had no big picture idea of writing about this woman and becoming so intimate with her after 20 years. I never knew that it would be like this. So I just kept going. And I was staying in Belleville, the 20th arrondissement, in a very immigrant working class area. I was staying with my friend whose daughter is the same age as my son's, and I would take her to school. I'd pay her gas bill. I was seeing this whole other side. It wasn't all Edith Piaf and Père Lachaise. And so I started to write about that. I was writing about what I saw, and it was never intended to write a series. So I just sort of kept going. And to me, Paris in the 90s was a place I experienced. It was a place that, again, was not the beret and baguette stereotype that a lot of us think about. And I never knew when I sold my book, I never knew if I would get a contract for another one, too. So maybe that sort of kept it very fresh in my mind.
I think it's really a gift to have had that experience, that you were just staying with an ordinary family doing these just the boring, mundane things. And I mean, that one of the things I just love about your books is that it could be about going to the bank, or it could be about some kind of a government hassle, like that's the clue. And the way often Aimée communicates with someone is she pretends to be from some sort of a bureau with some kind of inspection, and she does that very, very well in this particular book. In my experience, my India, it's my father is born in India during the period when the British were still in power. And I began going to India. I only went as a visitor, like as a family child visitor, starting in the 1970s, which was really only 25 years after the British had left. So there was like this gigantic hangover of Britain there, with all the children's books were British. Like there was not much television. There was just the kind of British foods in the hotels, and I felt all that. And also I had the, hanging out with Indian families that had not done well during the British period. I heard a lot of stories, like my dad could say, well, I remember the time that we were in a train together and someone came through and said we all had to get out of our compartment and give it to the British soldiers. And my father tried to argue, they were a large family with a lot of kids, and they wanted to settle for the night. And he tried to argue to stay in that compartment. And little stories like that, and being in my grandparents' apartment in Calcutta and walking around and realizing that there had been a freedom fighter who lived 2 blocks away, and his house was still standing, and it was furnished just the way it used to be, but now it was a museum and I could go in. I mean, I love that. It's a delightful life, isn't it?
Yeah, the Raj, the remnants of the Raj. Yeah. Well, when I figured that I was going to write about a detective, I figured, well, maybe I better meet a detective. So at the time I started writing, there were 3 detective agencies run by women in Paris. Of course, they worked in other different agencies. But so I went to interview the 3 of them, and they were very different people. And it was, I started saying, what is it like? And it's really kind of, the nuts and bolts are really not glamorous, stakeouts, surveillance, all the paperwork you need to do. And I did meet a young woman who was a detective, and she suffered from narcolepsy. And I said, how does surveillance work if you're suffering from narcolepsy? And we had this big discussion, and she said, well, I have certain things I bring to it. And another woman was in her 60s, and she ran this agency, and it was about 6 o'clock. I'll never forget, like a really cold November evening. And she said, Cara, I've got to go now. I'm going to have to go do surveillance. And I said, you're going out to do surveillance? And she said, yes, I have to go down to, I think it was Gare du Nord. She was looking for a missing woman. And she said, I'm going there, and I've been there. I've been on stakeout all week. I said, you've been down at the Gare du Nord all week doing a stakeout. Well, wouldn't people recognize you? She said, look at me. I'm a 60-year-old plus grandmother, and I'm invisible. And of course I go one day, I have a market bag with things, I have a raincoat. No one recognized her. And I said, wow, that's amazing. But I get it. And I said, what do you do when you have younger people you need to surveil? Oh, she hired a young woman who I met, who goes into discos and boîte de nuit and does the sort of, kind of trendy surveillance, who doesn't look out of place. I spent a day with her. She has a car and a motorcycle, and she has her disguises in the trunk of her car. So she'll take her motorcycle, then she'll drive her car and take her things out. And I thought, women can be anything. Women can be invisible. Women can change their look. They can go in and change their clothing. They can go and talk at a bureaucrat's office and pretend to be someone else to find the information. Because, right in Paris, I know people will nod their head. There's a little bit of bureaucracy, right, with a few things. So you've got to learn to manipulate that. The system D, they call it. How do you get around a law or a permit and I think as a detective, that's what you would really be skillful at. You would be changing your look, and I think that's fascinating. Women can be many different things, whereas a man might find it more difficult. I don't.
Speaking of women, when we were breaking into print in the 1990s, there were a lot of women's mysteries by women. I feel like this is the way I remember it, there was a lot of pink out there. There was a period when my books were coming out in the early 2000s that they were inevitably putting a high-heeled foot, a woman's foot in a high heel, preferably pink or purple, on just about every mystery novel being sold. And it was like we couldn't get away. I couldn't get away from it. And though I love fashion, I just did, I felt like that was kind of a limiting look. And there you come in, and your books they never looked like that. Your books always had this super edgy look. And so I wanted to talk to you about that time and whether you felt like there was a divide between like the novels that were by women that happened to be, they would be in forensics, they would be a coroner, for example, or they would be a policewoman. And then there was this whole other realm, which is probably where I was. The first series I wrote featuring a Japanese-American sleuth, Rei Shimura, she was an antiques expert. I mean, it was complete accidental sleuth. So I was over there. I feel like you were always blending these two.
Yeah, that's a good point you bring up. I think I was very influenced by Sue Grafton, Kinsey Malone, Sarah Paretsky, V.I. Washarsky. V.I. takes no prisoners, right? I love that strong woman. But I just wanted to write about a woman, a French woman. Of course, she's not totally French. She's half French, half American, because I can't even tie my scarf the right way. And this is an infinity scarf, so that doesn't count. But I wanted to write about the women I was seeing, and I wanted to write about a woman who would have a fashion gene in her, because I think a lot of French women do, and she would be born with that. She would also have been raised by men, which I think is very important to Aimée's character. Her father took over. He had been a disgraced policeman. Her grandfather, who ran the Leduc Detective Agency. And Friday nights, they were playing cards at the kitchen table, and there were all these off-duty fleeks, cops. So she's been raised with men. She doesn't have a real guide. She wishes that there were women in her life, but there weren't. But she's also has a feminine side, and she's vulnerable, and she's always wishing for family, which she will get. 4 books ago, she got her baby, and then she realizes that life is harder, of course, with a child, and it's not as, having a family. So I think her journey has been more to find out about family, always searching for it, wanting it, earning the baguette and buttering it as well. So she's just kind of her own person.
I feel like Perveen's going to live with her family a long time because she's a single woman. I mean, she's operating as a single woman. I don't want to give away too many spoilers.
But
and if you're living in Asia, I mean, even today, you would probably be living with your parents if you were in India. And so her dad is a lawyer, and he wanted her to be a lawyer because her older brother Rustam just wasn't suited for it. And she was super, super bright. And one of the things that was very special, and one reason that I set this series in Bombay, is it was the city in India where women became professionals first. This was largely part because of a minority religious community that were headquartered in Bombay. And these are the Parsis. They are Zoroastrians who were born in India. And the Zoroastrians I'm going to call them Parsis from this point on. They were more interested in, they wanted to get along with the British because they were doing fabulous business deals with them. And so they began looking at, well, if the British are saying that women can be going to universities and doing these things, we are going to want to send our daughters to Oxford, and so that they are keeping pace. And so it was a little bit of a status thing that Parsi parents wanted their daughters to become not just teachers, but principals and professors and doctors and lawyers.
Highly educated, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, from Iran, right? Originally they're from
and
Iran.
from a very long time ago, though, that maybe the first Zoroastrians who left Iran were maybe 700 AD, and they kind of trickled over because they had become a minority religion after Islam came to Persia. But there was also a large migration in the 19th century of Zoroastrians who are called the Iranis. They call them the Iranis. And they're the ones who have these wonderful cafes with the check tablecloths and the incredible pastries and really good chai. And, I have a lot of activity in those places.
Yeah,
just like you have them in your cafes.
Yeah, a lot of espresso drinking in the cafes. You have more food in your books. But
Yeah.
But I will say that Aimée's father wanted Aimée not to do what he did. He wanted her to go to medical school.
Oh, yeah.
And she was actually in medical school. And it was her grandfather, Claude, the bon vivant, who has the mistress, who goes to the auctions, who wanted her to follow her passion. So, Claude was more that way. And I just have to say that another fellow author of our Soho Press, Jim Benn, has the Billy Boyle mystery set in World War II. Well, Claude Leduc makes an appearance in the next Jimmy James's book. Yeah, Claude, a younger man in the 44.
Yeah.
So he was saying, does this seem like Claude in 1944? And yeah, he's maybe in the resistance. So it's a whole past that we find out about Aimée's grandfather.
Yeah, my character Perveen has these wonderful binoculars that she bought in Paris that I mentioned in the first book.
Yes.
The Parsis loved France.
Yeah.
And they really, really liked France a lot. So
Well, good taste.
yeah, and also that some people were exiled to France. Like there was this woman, Madame Kama, who was a Parsi who was very independence-minded, and the British government would not tolerate her in India. So she was in France, and then she was put under house arrest during World War I because she was trying to tell the Indian soldiers in France that they should not do anything for Britain. So, yeah, there are all kinds of parallels between, and with these wars going on and the people going back and forth. It's very interesting that we have this shared world.
In Murder and Clichy, I remember I was fascinated because I knew someone, and Ho Chi Minh, when he was, a young student, he came to he came to work in the Renault or Citroën, the car factory, which many people did. He left Indochina to do that, and he was working, but he was there to absorb all the, political discourse. Also, Lenin came, and many people came, and Cambodian Pol Pot came as a student, and they all came. They weren't the people we knew later from history, but they all came and absorbed and went back to Vietnam or to Cambodia and changed things. But Ho Chi Minh actually, he had done photography, and in the back of my friend's yard, they had the little hut. And the people from the museum in Hanoi came, and the only thing they could get where Ho Chi Minh had developed was a toilet. So they took the toilet, which had been in the shack where Ho Chi Minh had been developing film, and took it to the museum in Hanoi. So there's Khan. Hi, Khan. But if you go to that museum, you will see that toilet that came from Paris. But I don't know why I'm talking about that, but it just made me think about.
You know what I think it is? I almost feel like your books are really, some of them are like international thrillers. Especially this one, I think, which has, is it Côte d'Ivoire?
Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast in Africa.
So there's a lot of connections going back there. I feel like you want to zip around the world, but you're doing it from the point of that Paris is the resting ground. But it's perfect because really so many people come for that. We both are like a whole melting pot of intrigues For me, I'm so interested in that there were other people, not just Indians, who were interested in this freedom fight. There were other people who had problems with Britain, like the Irish had problems, right? So they were actually involved in cooperating with Indian freedom fighters, and we've seen that in some other Soho novels. And so there just are so many ways that we can bring in all these different people and all these different religious groups.
And France had such a close relationship with France Afrique, the African, when they were colonies. Of course, Belgium did as well. But there is a Côte d'Ivoirian restaurant in the 12th arrondissement that I passed by, and I was like, they're here. Okay, and I really wanted to use that as a base and explore one of the. He's a shadow minister who had been de Gaulle's man from the 50s, who basically manipulated and ran French Africa, all the colonies. And he's like a spider. And everything that happened in these colonies really was dictated in Paris. And when he was not officially in that position, he carried on and really influenced the son of Mitterrand, who I veil not very well in this story, but so they had pink Rolls Royces that they would drive around with in Côte d'Ivoire, Mitterrand's son and the dictator. So I think that's really important that these people want their own independence, their real independence. It's in Côte d'Ivoire was huge with the cocoa exportation. They were politically stable. It was like the jewel until 1999 when the story happened, and there was a coup d'etat. So it is sort of based on those events. But it's, colonial, there's so much influence still, or at that time, maybe 20 years ago, of the British in India. And you see that in Africa, they're speaking French still, Senegal and Morocco. And so that influence doesn't go away, right?
One of the things that's really delightful to do if you can in India is travel to these rest houses that the British built for their civil service officers to stay in when they traveled. Sometimes they would travel thousands of miles between, you might be posted in Bombay for, 2 easygoing years, and then you would have to go to the mountains and be, have maybe a more senior position, but you'd be the only British person there. And you would travel in these crazy, crazy ways across the country. Like you might be in a horse, or you might be on an elephant. You might be in a palanquin carried by...
Or a mail wagon. Poor Perveen is a mail wagon.
Oh, I did a lot of research on that. And some of these rest houses are now, open for people to stay in India. Usually, they're all owned by the Indian government. And so my dad has stayed in places like that because he travels with his best friend who is retired from... he was like a doctor in the jails, one of the things he did. So he has a pass so he can stay. And I've just heard these incredible stories. There's a wonderful book, in fact, about these bungalows. They're called dak bungalows. And apparently there would always be a caretaker. Nobody would be around except there'd be a caretaker. And when you would get there, they would say, "What kind of chicken do you want for dinner tonight?" Because all they would do is they would have chickens. They would have nothing else. And there were maybe 10 ways they could prepare the chicken.
Yes.
So I loved writing about that in this book. And fortunately, one of these kinds of places, an old circuit house type building, is in Mataran, a hill station, and you can actually stay there. And when I was there, it was during the rainy season, and it was hard getting up there. I was on a small horse. Led by somebody, and once I got there, I couldn't leave because it just rained and rained and rained and rained, and because it was the rainy season, like there can be problems with the food. Like it's not the safest time to be eating. So of course I got a little bit of food poisoning, and so I was just stay. But it wasn't that bad. It was like very, very minor, and I would just stay there and write. and there was no Wi-Fi. I mean, it was just.
You got a lot done.
Yeah,
I'm
I
sure.
got so much. Got so much done, and I really began to understand what it was like. This magic of staying in the hills, but being so isolated.
Well, when I was at Madame Gerbeau's apartment, who lives in the 12th, who overlooks the Cimetière Picpus, I started thinking about, all the history that's gone on here, because this whole area, the 12th arrondissement, had been the royal hunting grounds. The kings would go out there because it was outside of Paris. This was countryside. And so there were a lot of convents and monasteries out there because they were away. And a lot of these convents were run by abbesses who were no strangers to intrigue at court. Because during the royal days, a lot of the women who weren't married to a prince or a king would become nuns. So they were just put in these convents. But they could really manipulate things. And so this whole area was outside Paris. And then if you were coming into Paris, you would have to go through the toll gates at Place de la Nation, and you can see them today. And you go to these little houses and pay tax to bring things in. And I was thinking, wow, it was like another time. But as Paris, we know it just grows and grows. One wall gets knocked down, the next one, and it becomes 20 arrondissements as we know it. And this cemetery Picpus, first of all, I had never had a murder in a cemetery. So this was a, personal goal. I managed that. And it was also because it was right near where the pits are, where they, because at Place de la Nation was the worst excesses of the terror. 1,306 people were guillotined. They were put in carts, taken nearby, 5 minutes away, and pits were dug in an abbey, the grounds of a convent, and they were dumped in there. And later on, I think when Napoleon got power, he allowed the royals to secretly buy a postage stamp bit of land next to this, and they bought this private cemetery, one of only two in Paris, and they somehow, I don't know how, exhumed their royal family. I don't know if they took the heads or how they did. Anyway, they took them and buried them in the Cimetière Picpus, and they have their name on it. And if you are a descendant of the royal family, you can also be buried there, as is Marquis de Lafayette. Remember, he helped us out here in the Revolution a little bit? A little bit. Yeah. Well, he came back to Paris. He's buried there. He died of natural causes, but his mother-in-law and sister-in-law were decapitated. So he's buried there. The American flag flies at his tomb, and it's always been there. And it flew there during World War II when the Germans occupied Paris. So I heard the story that the Germans, as respect to Lafayette as a military man, they let the flag keep flying. Then I was doing a bookstore in Milwaukee when a woman said, I'm going to differ with you there, because I heard that the Germans could never find the Cimetière Picpus, so they couldn't take the flag down. And I said, you might be right as well. So I will offer both things. But so, and also when they opened the pits and they took the names of everyone who was buried there. And those 1,306 names are on the chapel wall. A chapel was built. Mm-hmm. And until not too long ago, there was a religious group that continually commemorated them. But you can read everyone's name, age, and profession. And the one I always remember is Marie, 17 years old, laundress. What did she ever do to merit that? But that history is there, and that convent is still there. And it's like even the most quiet, bucolic-looking places in Paris, you just scratch a little bit and under the surface, and there's so much history there.
This is making me think of like one of my last questions I wanted to ask you. It's really the $1 million question: is how do you stay so excited and engaged with one character after 20 years? Because I don't think I couldn't do it. So I'm curious how you did it.
Well, I get to go to Paris, don't I? So, I mean, and you get to go to India. I mean, I love doing that. And I think, of course, I never knew I was writing a series, but now I see there's an arc in her character. She has her daughter. We've sort of solved some things about her mother. We found out things about her father and her godfather, Commissaire Morbier. Well, we don't know. There's a big surprise in this book, which I didn't even know was happening until it happened. But it feels fresh to me. I do not outline, so I don't remember if you outline or not. I write from the place. I started at this cemetery and from Madame Gerbeau's balcony, and I was looking down. I went down to the convent with Madame Gerbeau. I started building this because I can take Aimée and see this part of her life. Well, right now it's a month or 2 months after that. The baby's taking little steps. I'm going in increments. We're still paying in francs. We can smoke in the cafes, and Chirac is doing all the things they later tried to indict him for. I like being in that time. Mm-hmm. So I'm moving very slowly forward, but I'm discovering things about her. When she has a baby, it's really hard running in a detective agency, trying to have a personal life and having a baby. Yeah. And, hoping your nanny, who's wonderful, by the way, is still, not going to get married and move to Marseille, which could happen.
I feel like that the second half of that question is sort of like what happened with me and I changed series. Like I started writing these Japanese books in the 1990s, and there are a number of people that would love it if I still was doing this at the same time. And I think that when I was writing those books, I was married, but I did not have children. And so for me, that whole lifestyle of going to Japan on a research trip, it was possible. It was just a lot easier. And so after I became a parent, I was suddenly more engaged with India. I was engaging with this part of my own history. Yeah. Because I was spending all this time with my parents and the children, and we were doing all these sort of Indian things in our household. And so it even though it was a foreign country, it felt easier. It just felt like the place to go. And I'm glad that I made that change. And there were 11 books in that series. And I always say I might write another one, but I feel like I would physically have to leave the United States to do it. I would have to get closer to Japan to do it, to be able to sink again into feeling the way that I once did. Mm-hmm. And for the time being, this is where I am, even though it's, about 100 years ago.
That's right. Yeah.
So what is next for you, Cara?
Next for me, I'm only going back to 1940. And we just got the comps today for the cover, which is right, you liked it.
I loved it. It's beautiful, but it's not an Aimée book.
Oh, it's not an Aimée Leduc
Yeah, that's
book.
the big thing.
It's a historical thriller set in the first 2 weeks of the German occupation of Paris. And if I told you any more, I'd have to kill you. But it's I don't know what I should say. I don't want to.
Can you say that it's based on this real known fact about 3 hours?
Yes, it's based on the book is called 3 Hours in Paris. That's actually going to be the title now. It comes out April 14th. If we get it, the copy edit's done in time. Mm-hmm. And it's based on Hitler's one and only visit to Paris, which you can see in YouTube newsreels. Watch them very carefully. Because why did Hitler leave after 3 hours? What could have happened? Why did two of the many people, he brought a whole group with him, his art group. He brought Albert Speer, the architect of the Third Reich. He brought Arno Brecker, a sculptor who had lived in Paris, with him, his sculptor. And they were both, you can see the pictures of them together. And why did years later, when Speer got out of prison and Brecker was rehabilitated, did they both write down 2 different dates of that visit? Well, these were both 2 dates in 2 different books. So I posit the 2 men that were with him wrote 2 different accounts, 2 different dates. I think there was a little fake news going on, folks. Faux news. So that's all I can say. But yeah. I think there's, anyway. Thank you. Well, yeah, it's really different. We go back to 1940. We have, it starts in the Orkney Islands in Scotland. And yeah, we go from there.
I think it's going to be this great palate cleanser for you. You know, this very refreshing to do just a little something different. And my next book, it hasn't yet got an official title, but I would like to call it The Cutting Master Affair. How do you like that? The Cutting Master Affair. Cutting Master is a name for somebody who works with fabric, who works with tailoring. Like one of the wonderful things that happened with the Parsis when in India is when they were asked to give surnames, often they just gave the name of what their job was. So you wind up with somebody like Soda Walla, someone who sells sodas, or you wind up with someone with the last name that is literally lawyer or banker or contractor, and it just, and often it was in English. And so I came across that name, Cutting Master. And so I'm writing about Perveen gets a visit one day from a young woman student at Wilson College, which was a missionary college. It's the first college in Bombay, and it still exists. And her name is Frenny Cutting Master, and her dad is a tailor. And she does not want to participate in a viewing when the Prince of Wales comes to visit. The Prince of Wales actually visited Bombay in the fall of 1921, and this is the man who later became Edward VIII, who was who abdicated. But he was this handsome young man in his late 20s when he came, and this visit was supposed to reassure Indians that that the royal family and that England loved India and was going to do very well by it, and there was no need to be independent. But what happened is lots and lots of riots broke out, and many people died, many more were injured and arrested. So there is a problem for poor Frenny Cutting Master when all this stuff is going on, and it's a big turning point for Perveen because until then, the Parsis had been fairly positive about independence, but these riots, Hindus and Muslims were attacking Parsis because they thought they were loyalists to the prince and the royal and Britain, and they were fighting back. So it's like a very complicated political story. Just like we both love to write about these political stories.
Yeah,
I'm having a good time with it.
Good. Yeah. So, and can I mention one more thing? Yes, since there's several people here who've been with us. Sheila, stand up, and Donna, please. Stand up. So this is Sheila of Blue Yonder Travel, who does trips here. Wild Blue Yonder, and Donna, who lives in Paris with her cat. And we do trips, but she left her cat. We do trips to Paris, Aimée Leduc trips. And tell them about the one in October, Donna.
Well, several people are here that have been on some of the trips, but and on some of the Cara ones too.
Yes.
So we basically just put a week together, and I choose a couple of murders, and we explore that part of town or whatever. She has to give me little notes here and there, but I'm really excited about this one because to start the tour in the cemetery. It's very gruesome too. I don't know where she got all that. But anyway, so we just do a week of touring Paris, and we do a couple of murders, usually three
places, and we go to different places in the book. Yeah.
And we came up for the one that Cara and I are going to do in October. We're going to do murder in Belleville, murder in the Latin Quarter, and murder in
Bel-Air. We're getting special permission to visit Aimée Leduc's historic apartment on the Ile Saint-Louis. Donna figured that out, but yeah, we're going to go.
But we have fun. It's just a week of fun. But when Sheila and I also have done, we do other, it's not just Carol, we've done a lot of other, Martin Walker, we have a Martin Walker trip coming up now. But they're not all always author related, but often. We have fun. We have the soiree every night. We have wine. That's the song point.
Yeah.
There we go.
What a brilliant idea. I've got to do this.
You have to do it. Yeah.
I'll need to assemble a team.
Yeah. Hill Station visit. Yeah.
Now, what about you all? Do you have questions for us? We've got a microphone here.
Two microphones.
Two of them, yeah. If anybody has questions for either of us.
Hi, I have a question for Cara, but I wanted to say something about Ho Chi Minh in Paris, too. He was not only a founding member of the Vietnamese Communist Party, as we might expect, he was a founding member of the French Communist Party as well. And one of the reasons he became a communist was that the French Communist Party was the only political party in France that would support independence for Vietnam. He went to all of them, and that was the only one that would support that. So
Good to know.
my question is, if Aimée is half American, does she feel half American? Because she reads so French. And other than having a mother who was a former terrorist, I don't know if that's a good description of what an American is, how is she half American?
I think she's more neither fish nor fowl character because she was raised by men who are, former policemen Frenchmen, and the American mother was never there. They never talked about her. They would be quiet when she came into the room, if they had been talking about her. Her mother was never mentioned. So there's a stigma there. So she's never really been raised by an American. She did come in one story. She went to Houston or Dallas and bought cowboy boots in the airport, but never could find her mother. She's also trying sometimes to go to America to find her, but doesn't. And so I think she's sort of the odd person, but I think she's sort of in the mold of the traditional detective, kind of a lone wolf, if you will, someone who is, what is that famous quote by Chandler? Down these mean streets will a man go who is not evil himself, but to seek the evil, or butchering that quote. But there's something about her that she's always going to fight for the person who's never mentioned, the underdog. She's always for that voice that is not heard. And I think that's probably more that she is an outsider. She doesn't feel totally French, but she's certainly not American. And she also envies Martine, her best friend since the lycée, who has all these sisters and this warm family. And Martine's always trying to set her up, but she just doesn't get that. And when her daughter Chloe is born, she's like, why didn't she come with an instruction booklet? Because I don't know how to do this. I think we all want that as well. But so I think she's just an outsider like that. If that answers your question.
Sujata, I have a two-part question. The first part is, since you mentioned that Ray Shimura is a figure that people would like to see again, if you were to bring her back, what sort of time frame would that be in? And then secondly, because your books are so visual, at least when I read them, and because they're so filled with historical facts, I could see them being a miniseries. I could see them being a movie. Has there ever been an exploration of bringing them to life on film?
Well, I'm going to address that thing about the film first because it's like I am on the phone every week about it. So I've had a lot of offers, but the question is taking the right offer, because what often happens is they love your book and they want to take it, but they want to have control over the character and write their own stories. And there's nothing more. I would absolutely love to have a mini series or like a digital TV, which is what most of these offers are for that. But I feel very strongly that I want India to be represented correctly. And I've spent so many years learning about colonial India and about, Muslims and Parsis. And I just can't imagine that like a group of people sitting in Hollywood will be able to do that right. Like it's either I've got it, they can work with my books or I can be a writer on it. So it's just an ongoing. And so right now I'm still in a discussion, but there have been many, many, many no's, unfortunately. But as far as the Ray Shimura series goes, you were saying what time would it be? I'd kind of like to pick up, there have only been 3 years passing in Ray Shimura's life. She lives in an alternate universe, which started in 1997 when cell phones were completely new and they were just like a thing in Japan, that it was just really, it was nowhere else. But it's so all this time has passed, but Ray is 30 and she's got this person in her life and she's based in Hawaii. So I would like to pick it up there at that exact place. You know, the last place we saw Ray was it was after the tsunami, which was 2012, 2011, 2004?
A long time ago.
Oh my gosh, so it was even worse. Yeah, I moved in 2012. It was before then. So that's where she was last. So I would like to bring her. I would like to say in that magic universe it was, 2022, but no time had passed. So it's like very interesting that you're sticking to the 90s.
Totally.
I'm flying through time, but she's not aging. Well, wouldn't it be that we could all go
Sarah
through that? Wouldn't
Paretsky
be
does
good
that
for
as
everybody?
well. Sarah Paretsky does that. But I like not having to worry about Facebook and Twitter and everything, which I never knew I would like that. But just to jump on that. So I did sign an agreement, a film TV agreement. Yeah.
Oh. So
Paramount TV.
Oh,
Is it Paramount?
So so they're developing it as a TV
They're
series.
developing it. Yes,
Yeah,
that
they call it
Hollywood
developing.
speak. It's in development, but there is a showrunner, which I've heard is good, and they bought the series,
Yeah,
and I have no idea.
I'm happy about that for you.
Yeah, we need to talk. But anyway, there's also the whole thing of will this ever even be made too?
Yeah.
So.
My sister-in-law is a writing teacher, and the very first thing she tells her students is to tell her about a place they like. And what tips or tricks do you have for establishing a sense of place in your writing?
Sensory detail, I think, is really important. The smells and the touch, which I think we often don't talk about. We don't talk about the tactile sense, the sounds, the aura of that place. But I think that's really important. I mean, I certainly feel it in your books. I mean, we are there in Raj, India, and I want to take you to 90s Paris, when you're going to see that and smell that butter and, the diesel and people are going to be reading newspapers. They're going to have newspaper ink on their fingers because people are still reading newspapers. But every kind of sensory detail, I think, is
Like from a practical point of view, if you want to write, especially about another place where you don't live, whether it's across another state or another country, before I go to that place, I reach out and I arrange interviews. Like I find out about people who know about things. Like, for example, I found out about this person who's a real police buff who really interested in the history of police. I'm going to really try to track him down. I've tracked down freedom fighters, people that were actually involved in the unrest, in the 20s and 30s. Like there's barely anyone alive, but so I make those appointments ahead of time. And then the other thing is I try to take offbeat walking tours. There's so many good offbeat walking tours now, and that when you're on foot with a person, and they will often veer and take you somewhere else, and you learn and you can ask questions. I mean, that's how I learned a lot about Muslim women's lives, is that I walked around Bombay with somebody from that culture.
I do that as well in Paris with fleeks, with retired police. Matter of fact, when I was with you, Don, I found the shoemaker who sells these espadrilles, and he's next to the butcher, who is one of 22 horse butchers left in Paris. There used to be 160, but near the 15th in the Parc Georges Brassens, where there used to be the abattoir. And so I went in, and it was kind of weird going and seeing the carcasses of horses, but Aimée has to go there to get horse meat for her dog, Mise Davis. So I talked to him, what is it like, being a butcher? And he's 90 years old, but he's still wearing that white bloody apron and working. But those kind of people who are really,
Treasures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I have one thank you and one question. We came back from Paris and we had stayed near the Bastille, and we walked down the viaduct, which you mentioned in Murder in Bel-Air. taking a map of Paris and looking at the places you mention and comparing them to our walk down the viaduct. If you want to read Miss Black, if you do it with a map of Paris and you look up everything, I think you'll find it adds to your enjoyment. It did to ours. So thank you for that. My question, and this is a unique opportunity, having cognitive dissonance, because on the one hand, I'm reading about Africa, and the criticism is that the boundaries cross over tribal borders, and this is a bad thing. On the other hand, the British took a place of many Maharajas and other political divisions and effectively unified them. Now, in this country, we're saying we must honor and cultivate diversity. So from the point of view of multiple cultures being included in boundaries in Africa and multiple political divisions being united in the colonial period in India, can you derive some lesson from that for the United States today on how to handle we're cultivating diversity and we're criticizing places that by artificial borders created diversity within a country?
I think we need to go to the State Department, but I guess I would say that India was so enriched by the immigrants that came from all different parts of Asia, and it was this mosaic where there were people who were, that they were speaking so many different languages, different customs, and before, when there were all these princely states, they weren't princely states, they were kingdoms. It seemed like people were safe. It felt very safe to be in your own quartier, right, or your own area. And then it was when there were the artificial divisions that were made when Britain
Pakistan
left, and they said, well, this area is going to be Pakistan, this is going to be India. That's when it was so difficult. And now people want to have these little places back, but that's causing violence again, too. If you look at separatists and so on. So it's no easy answer because people don't trust each other and they worry about the other, I think.
The only thing I could add is just speaking about France, what I saw in the 90s was the colonial legacy. These are the people who came, maybe they came from Algeria in the 60s or Morocco or whatever, and they came and they worked really hard and they found places. They were out in the suburbs, and then now it's their great-grandchildren who have Arab-sounding names and who are still in the suburbs, which is some of them are pretty grim and face discrimination. So I think the generational is different from great-grandpa who came to work and, to make money and to make it better for his, I think this generation that we know now is very different. So I think you have to think of it generational, I don't know. That's all I can say.
I think the more international mysteries that people read, the more tolerance grows, honestly. So share them with your friends.
And make sure they have a map of Paris when they read, or a map of India. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we are actually out of time, unfortunately. If you have thought of a question and didn't manage to get up, please feel free to hop in the signing line, whether you're getting a book signed or not. Ask your question there. Can we get one more round of applause for our authors?